So let's go ahead and implement now a service where we have control over the whole lifetime. Now, again, the demo I'm using for this is the same demo we've been using throughout. And again, I'm starting all the way back to the beginning where I simply had an activity, and that activity did all of its work right in line on its main thread. Right? So it just creates the worker, again, gets the GPS location, reverse geocodes that, get that as an address, and then saves it. Right? So what we're going to do now is actually implement this again as a service, but instead of being a simple on-demand service, we're going to do it as a service where we have total control over its lifetime. Right, so the first thing I want to do is go ahead and add a class to this. Now, just again, one thing to note, when I go out here, I say new. If I wanted to, I simply could say new Android component, right, and choose service. And this would take care of most of the work for me, laying out the class, adding my manifest entries, and so forth. But again, I'm going to do it manually just so we see all the steps involved. Right, so we'll say new. We'll say a Java class. Right, and I'll just call this guy my worker service. Remember, it has to extend service. Now, there's one method we're always required to override. We'll take a look here. Right, that's that on-bind method I mentioned. And the thing that's funny about it is that you always have to override it, but in started services, you always just go ahead and set it to null anyway. So we've got that there. Now, remember that we want to go ahead and implement those lifecycle methods. Right? So I'm going to go here and just go to the code, override methods. And what I make sure I get is my onCreate, my onDestroy, and my onStart command. So that sets those guys all up for us there. Right? Now I'm just going to move the order of these around a little bit so that they're up here in the order that they actually occur. Okay, so we have that. So now we can do our implementation. Right? Now we mentioned that onStart command is where we actually do all of our work. Right? So we might kind of start out here by saying that let's go out to the do work. Let's just go ahead and grab that code. Right? We'll put that into our onStart command because that's really kind of our worker method, right? Now we mentioned that we have to return a value from onStart command that indicates to the operating system how we want things behaved. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to return one of the common ones here, and we'll talk about what our options are in just a minute. So say return. I'm going to choose start, not sticky. And that simply means that if it gets shut down for resource reasons, don't restart it. Again, we'll talk about what all the options are for that in a few slides. So now we've got that there. Now, if I went ahead and just ran with the service as it is right here, it would work, right? But the thing is that, well, this is no different than that on-demand service I had, right? So each time work comes along, it comes into our onStart command, we create our worker, we go out there and get our location, reverse geocode it, and save it. Right? Remember that we have the ability to control our own lifetime. So maybe we'd like to do something a little more intelligent than this, just something to make the service a little bit smarter. Right, now let's take a look at the way our worker get location is implemented. If I go back here, and remember the way this was set up, get location, is that it always just says go get last known location. Right? So what we're saying is that, well, when they make a request, I don't want to spin the GPS up right now and go wait for that to come. I just want to get the last one I've known about. And a method like get last known location relies on the fact that you must be getting GPS locations with some regularity. Right? So normally you're expecting that something else is going on that's causing the GPS to be working for you. Right? So you may not need the most, one from this exact moment in time, but you want something that's fairly recent. So what we can do with this service now, since we control our own lifetime, what might be nice is actually have the service when it's started that actually have it fire up the GPS and have it periodically getting updates for that GPS. So what I've done here is inside of our worker class, the same worker class we've been using for all the demos, I've added a couple of new methods here. One here is monitor GPS in background. Okay, and what this method does for us is it actually goes out and gets the location manager and it starts getting GPS updates. Now what it's doing is that it's running it on a background thread, right? So it's not affecting the user or anything. It just fires up its own thread here and runs on that. And the thing you'll notice is that whenever you get a location, you have to give it a location listener. Right? You notice I've got this no-op location listener here. And what this does, if we scroll down, you'll notice that no-op location listener implements the location listener interface, but none of it does anything. Right? And that actually works out fine for us. And the reason being that we don't need to store the GPS coordinates in our own program anywhere. Remember that we're always using that get last known location, right? So if we take a look at that, right, that's asking the GPS provider layer, what was the last location you saw? Right, so by us running in the background here and just kind of pumping the GPS provider underneath of it is actually storing that last location for us all the time. Right, so if we set our service up so that when we're created, we start monitoring. Now, whenever another application makes a request to our service for the most recent location, they're actually going to get a fairly recent location because we're monitoring for it all the time. Right, so in order to do that, we'll go back to our service here. And what I'm going to do is, rather than create the worker right here in onStart command, let's go ahead and make that a class level variable. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and create the instance of that worker in our onCreate method. All right, so now with that in place, we want to go ahead and tell our worker to go ahead and fire up that background monitoring GPS for us. Okay, and that starts that going for us. So now that we have that in place, we notice that our monitor GPS in background, if I take a look at my worker class, in addition to the monitor GPS in background, I've also got to stop GPS monitoring. So we should call that when our service is all done. All right, so we'll go back here. In our onDestroy, we'll just call that stop monitoring. All right, now stop it for us. And the last thing we need to do is that, well, since we've got this worker instance that we're using all the time, rather than create a new one here in onStart command, let's just go ahead and reuse that same one. All right, so as long as I've done everything fine there, I should have the implementation of my service just fine. All right, so let's do a quick build. Now remember that we're still implementing a service, so we still want to make it visible inside of our manifest. All right, so we'll go back to our Android manifest. All right, inside application. We're at our service tag. Or give it the name, or that name is the class that implements it, right? So our class is the worker service inside that com.pluralsight package, right? But because the package is already defined here at the manifest level, I can just say dot worker service. I'll go ahead and give it a label. Right, so that actually defines my service. Now, if we want to make this service available to be called from other processes besides our own, we want to go ahead and put an intent filter in here. So let's just go ahead and do that. Okay, we'll go ahead and filter on action like we did in our previous examples. All right, so again, we're going to put it inside of our package namespace here, com.pluralsight. All actions go inside of an action sub namespace. And instead of calling it do work, because I called it do work in the earlier examples, I'll just call it do work too. The point there being is that we don't want to have multiple services all responding to that same action. I mean, we could, but it could be confusing if you're running this stuff at home and you're doing it on your emulators and you've got multiple services installed on that emulator. It can become very confusing. So I'm going to make sure that each one of these have their own action, so that if you call one that way, you get the one you expect. All right, so that goes ahead and defines our service for us. So we've got that all there. Now remember that in order to get to the service, of course, we have to actually call out to it. All right, so inside of our activity, we're going to have to go ahead and set up an intent to call it. Remember, when I create the intent, because this service is running in the same process as this activity, I can either use the service class type base intent, or I can actually use the action. Right? For simplicity, I'll just go ahead and use the type based one. Right, so we'll say new intent. All right, that sets it up for us. So now we can just say start service. All right, so all's good there. So let's go back to our service and let's put a couple of breakpoints in here. So we know we've got our onCreate. Right, we've got our work inside of onStart command. And of course we have our onDestroy. Right, so we'll just go ahead with the onCreate and our onStart command. So I'm going to go ahead and run this inside the emulator. All right, so I'll just do menu, do work. So of course we hit our onCreate, right? That works for us. We'll go ahead and release that. And we do our onStart command, so we'll go ahead and release that. All right, so now that's up and running, if I go ahead and call out to do work again, this time I should just hit my onStart command. And as you can see, we just jump right to our on start command.